I have kept every letter you ever wrote. Those words came out of Harlan Lockhart's mouth so quietly that Ida Blackwell almost missed them entirely, almost let them dissolve into the dry Arizona wind that swept across the fence line between his property and the road that led out of Redrock Crossing. But she did not miss them. She could not have missed them if she had tried, because the weight of those words landed against her chest like a stone dropped from a great height, and she felt the impact travel all the way down into the ground beneath her boots. "What did you say to me?" she whispered. Harlan was not looking at her. He was looking at the fence post, his hands wrapped around the weathered top rail, his knuckles pale from the grip. The badge on his chest caught the dying afternoon light and threw it back in a thin silver flash. He was a man built for silence, for solitude, for the kind of stillness that most men could not hold without cracking. But right now that stillness was fracturing at every seam. "I said I have kept every letter you ever wrote," he repeated, and this time his voice was not quiet at all. It was raw. Without knowing it was you, Ida felt the world rearrange itself around her. The red dust, the cottonwood trees, the distant sound of Redrock Crossing's evening bell marking 6 o'clock, the smell of cook fires and mesquite, all of it remained exactly where it had been one moment before, and yet somehow nothing was in the right place anymore. Her throat tightened around a sound she could not identify as laughter or grief. "The letters to the Redrock Gazette," she said slowly, not as a question. "The letters to the Redrock Gazette." He finally turned to look at her, and what she saw on his face was the single most devastating thing she had ever witnessed in 26 years of living on the frontier. It was not anger. It was not accusation. It was a man who had just discovered that the thing he had been searching for had been standing 6 feet away from him for the past 8 months, and the discovery was doing something terrible and irreversible to every fortified wall he had ever built around himself. "You told me you hated those letters," she said, and now her voice had an edge she had not intended to put there, something bright and dangerous, something that came from a dark place she did not visit often. "You said the person who wrote them was a meddling fool. You said those exact words to Deputy Calhoun outside the jailhouse, and I was standing on the other side of the door, Harlan. I heard you." The silence that followed that statement was not the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other well. It was a betrayal of a silence, loaded with every secret that had passed between them through the innocent vehicle of ink and paper, and a false name, and neither of them could find the first word to begin dismantling it. That moment at the fence was the end of something and the beginning of something else entirely. But to understand what it meant, you would have to go back to the beginning, back to the day 8 months prior, when a woman named Ida Blackwell stepped off a westbound stage in Redrock Crossing, Arizona Territory, in the spring of 1883, carrying 2 leather bags, a box of medicinal herbs, and a secret that she had not yet decided whether to keep. Redrock Crossing in 1883 was a town in the process of deciding what it wanted to be. It had the bones of something permanent, a general store owned by a man named Elias Prentice, a telegraph office, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a doctor's office where the doctor, one Gerald Fenwick, was perpetually 3 drinks past useful, a land office, a hotel called the Saguaro Rest that had 7 rooms and a dining hall, and a sheriff's office with a single jail cell that had been occupied almost continuously for the past 2 years by a rotating cast of drunks, horse thieves, and men with outstanding warrants from Texas. The sheriff's office was presided over by Harlan Lockhart, who had been appointed to the position 3 years ago after the previous sheriff had died of a fever, and the town council had been left scrambling. Harlan had come to Redrock Crossing from nowhere in particular, or more accurately from a past he did not discuss, and he had taken the badge and the responsibility with a gravity that most men reserved for religious conversion. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulder, lean through the jaw, with dark hair that he wore too long because he did not often remember to have it cut, and gray eyes that had the particular quality of appearing to look directly through whatever they fixed upon. He was not a popular man in the way that popular men are popular. People did not invite him to supper and feel comfortable when he arrived. But they trusted him absolutely, and in a town like Redrock Crossing, trust was a currency worth considerably more than affection. Ida Blackwell had come to Redrock Crossing to work as a schoolteacher, the position having been advertised in a Phoenix newspaper the previous autumn. She was 26. With dark reddish-brown hair she kept pinned tightly at the back of her neck, brown eyes that missed very little, and hands that were always slightly ink-stained because she wrote constantly, and did not always wait for the ink to dry before turning a page. She had grown up in Santa Fe, New Mexico territory, the daughter of a woman who taught her that words were the only truly portable possession a person could carry through a life that might require them to move quickly and without warning. Her mother had died 2 years before Ida arrived in Redrock Crossing, and the loss had left her with a restlessness she could not fully explain, a sense that she needed to plant herself somewhere new and see if she could grow differently. She had applied for the teaching position with a letter so precisely constructed and so luminously argued that the school board, composed of Elias Prentice, the Reverend Caldwell, and a rancher named Tom Briggs, had hired her by return mail without requiring a personal interview. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, stepped down from the stage into the coppery dust of Redrock Crossing's Main Street, and immediately walked into something she had not anticipated. There was a man standing in front of the stage office with his arms crossed, and his expression arranged into the particular configuration of someone who had been waiting longer than they found acceptable. He was wearing a sheriff's badge and looking at the stage driver with an intensity that the driver was clearly finding uncomfortable. "I asked you a direct question," the man said, "and I gave you a direct answer," the driver replied, not making eye contact. "You gave me a direction, east. East is not an answer when I am asking about a man who has stolen 3 horses and is currently wanted by 2 different territories." Ida stepped around them both because she had learned early in life that walking into other people's disputes was rarely a productive use of time. She collected her bags from the stage's luggage boot, nodded politely at the stage driver's assistant, and began walking toward the hotel. She had made it perhaps 20 feet when she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her, moving at a pace that suggested purposeful interception rather than casual coincidence. "Ma'am." The voice was low and even and did not contain a request. "Are you Ida Blackwell, the new schoolteacher?" She turned. The sheriff was closer than she had expected and taller, and the gray eyes were doing the thing she would later come to associate entirely with him, that particular way of looking that made a person feel simultaneously assessed and seen. "I am," she said. "Harlan Lockhart. I am the sheriff here. The council asked me to make sure you arrived safely and to introduce you to the town." "That is very kind of the council," she said, noting the careful neutrality of his tone, the sense that this was a duty he was discharging because he had agreed to discharge it, not because it gave him any particular pleasure. "I will take your bags to the saguaro rest," he said, and reached for them before she could protest, which she had intended to do. She watched him lift both of them as though they weighed nothing, which they did not, but she found his assumption of the task simultaneously irritating and, she had to admit to herself, rather efficiently considerate. "Thank you," she said, because her mother had taught her to accept help graciously even when it was offered with more confidence than invitation. They walked along the main street, and Harlan Lockhart told her the names of the businesses they passed with the brisk efficiency of a man giving a report. He told her where the school was, which days the supply wagon came through, where she could find clean water, and where she absolutely should not go after dark, the last item being the area behind the Copper Penny Saloon, which he delivered without apology or elaboration. He did not ask her where she had come from, or why she had wanted to come to Redrock Crossing, or what she thought of Arizona territory, or any of the personal questions that most people led with when meeting someone new. She found this both refreshing and, in a way she could not quite articulate, slightly disappointing. He left her at the hotel with a brisk nod and returned the way he had come, and Ida Blackwell stood in the small clean room the hotel gave her and listened to the sounds of the town settling into its evening, and thought that this was going to be an interesting place to live. She began teaching within the week. There were 14 children in the Redrock Crossing school, ranging in age from 6 to 15, and they were as varied as the territory itself. Some came from ranching families who had been in Arizona for 2 generations. One was the son of a Chinese man who had come west to work on the railroad and stayed. 2 were the children of a Mexican family who ran a small farm south of town. Ida treated them all with the same precise, demanding, affectionate attention she gave to everything she cared about. And within a month the parents were saying that the new schoolteacher was something altogether different from the last one, who had lasted 6 months before citing the dust and the loneliness and going back east. Ida did not find the dust difficult. She did not find the loneliness difficult either, at least not the version that most newcomers struggled with, the absence of society and entertainment and distraction. She had always found the best company in the world inside books and in the act of writing, and Redrock Crossing, for all its roughness, had something that fed her particular hunger. It had, in the words of Elias Prentice, the finest example of a Wild West newspaper west of Tucson, which was an exaggeration of considerable proportion, but the Redrock Gazette, a weekly 4-page broadsheet printed by a man named Samuel Webb, was nonetheless a genuine and earnest enterprise. Samuel Webb printed local news, territorial notices, wanted posters, land auction announcements, and a column he called Letters from the Territory, in which he published correspondence from readers on whatever topic moved them. Ida read the first issue she could find and discovered immediately that the letters column was dominated by 2 things: complaints about the price of beef and complaints about Sheriff Harlan Lockhart. The complaints about the sheriff were interesting. They came primarily from a faction in town, associated with a rancher named Curtis Halley, who controlled more land east of town than anyone else, and who had, according to several letters, been obstructed in various business endeavors by the sheriff's insistence on applying the law with an even-handedness that Halley found inconvenient. The letters accused Lockhart of being cold, of being arrogant, of being so devoted to the letter of the law that he had no human feeling whatsoever, and of ruling over Redrock Crossing like a man who had appointed himself judge and jury as well as sheriff. Ida read these letters and felt something stir in her that she recognized as the particular restlessness that preceded the writing of a counter-argument. She sat down that evening with paper and ink and wrote a response. She did not use her own name, partly because she was new and did not want to create enemies before she had fully unpacked, and partly because she had a theory that arguments made on their merits, without the distraction of the arguer's identity, were more honestly received. She signed the letter with the name "A Friend of Justice" and left it at Samuel Webb's print shop the following morning. Samuel Webb published it in the next issue, and the issue after that brought 2 furious responses, and Ida wrote another letter addressing both of them with a precision that she privately found satisfying, and the thing was set in motion. She wrote a letter nearly every week for the next 6 months. She wrote about the importance of an impartial law in frontier settlements. She wrote about the particular courage required to enforce that law against men with money and influence, a pointed observation that she was careful to frame as general principle rather than specific accusation. She wrote about the necessity of considering the rights of smaller landholders and the dangers of allowing powerful individuals to bend local governance to suit their private interests. She did not know, for the first 3 months, that Harlan Lockhart read every single letter she wrote. She found out by accident, in the way that most important things are found out in small towns, by being in the right place at the wrong moment. She had stopped by the sheriff's office one afternoon in July to drop off a piece of correspondence for Deputy Calhoun, who was also the town's unofficial postmaster, a role that had evolved because the actual mail was delivered to the stage office, and Calhoun had positioned himself as the person who knew where everyone was and what they needed, a talent that made him invaluable and occasionally maddening. The door to the office was not fully closed. She had her hand raised to knock when she heard Deputy Calhoun, a cheerful, gap-toothed man of about 40, say something about the Gazette, and then she heard Harlan's voice say, "The meddling fool who keeps writing those letters knows nothing about what it actually takes to hold a town together." Ida's hand remained suspended in the air. "He makes some fair points, though," Calhoun said. "People are listening. People like to read things that confirm what they already believe," Harlan said, and his voice had that flat, impenetrable quality that she had come to recognize as his version of frustration, which was as close to emotion as he allowed himself in public. "That letter last week about frontier justice and individual rights was beautifully written, I will grant it that, and it was also the argument of someone who has never had to look a man in the eye and decide in 3 seconds whether to believe him." Ida lowered her hand. She stepped back from the door and returned the way she had come, and she sat with what she had heard for a long time before she decided what to do with it. She did not stop writing the letters, but she began to write them differently. She began to include, alongside the arguments about justice and law, small acknowledgments of the weight of the work, the impossible position of the person who must enforce rules that were not always equal, in a territory where the rules themselves were still being argued. She wrote about loneliness in a way that she told herself was abstract, philosophical, but which she knew, if she was being honest with herself in the small, dark hours before dawn, was something else entirely. Because she had noticed Harlan Lockhart, not only in the way that everyone in a small town notices the person with the most authority, but in the way that you notice something when you are paying close attention for reasons you have not yet admitted to yourself. She noticed that he ate his meals alone at the Saguaro Rest's dining hall every single evening and read while he ate, always something dense and substantial, a legal text or a history book, never fiction. She noticed that he checked on the church twice a week in a manner that suggested he had made a private promise to do so. She noticed that when the Navarro children, the Mexican family's 2 youngest, were caught throwing rocks at the window of Elias Prentice's store, Harlan spoke to them in the street for 20 minutes and did not involve Prentice until he had a clear picture of everything that had happened, and that he concluded by telling Prentice in front of the children that they would perform 1 week of work at the store as fair recompense, and that the matter was settled. And his tone made it very clear that the matter was indeed settled. She noticed that he never laughed. Not once in 6 months did she see him laugh. She saw him come close to it twice, once when a particularly unlucky drunk walked headfirst into the saloon's swinging door, and once when a letter in the Gazette contained an unintentional grammatical error, so spectacular that even Samuel Webb included a printed correction that was funnier than the original error. But the near laughter disappeared quickly, locked away behind the gray eyes and the flat expression, as though he had decided at some point that happiness was a luxury that men in his position could not safely afford. It was that observation, more than any other, that caused her to write the letter that, though she did not know it at the time, he would read 17 times and keep folded in the inside pocket of his vest for 3 months before transferring it to the small wooden box where he kept the others. She wrote it in August, when the Arizona heat was at its most unforgiving, sitting at the small desk in her room at the Saguaro Rest with the window open and a candle burning beside her because the last light of evening had not been enough. She wrote about a hypothetical sheriff in a hypothetical town, about the way that absolute devotion to duty over time could become its own kind of prison, about how the law was ultimately a human creation designed to protect human beings, and that a person who enforced it without maintaining his own humanity was not a guardian but a machine, and that the town deserved both the law and the man. She signed it as she always did, a friend of justice, and she left it at the print shop the next morning without reading it again, which she always did because rereading made her second guess, and second guessing diluted the truth of what she had written. Samuel Webb published it, and 2 weeks later, Ida was reading the following issue of the Gazette in the hotel dining hall when she found, in the letters column, a response. It was not signed with a name. It was signed, "A Defender of the Peace." It said, "A friend of justice argues that the guardian of the law must maintain his humanity. I would put to that friend a simpler question. What does a man do with his humanity when the town needs the law more than it needs the man?" I do not ask this to contradict. I ask it because I do not know the answer. Ida read it 3 times. Then she folded the paper carefully, placed it in her room, and sat down at her desk and wrote back. She wrote that the question was not whether the town needed the law or the man, but whether the man could sustain himself long enough to keep giving the town either. She wrote that loneliness was not a virtue, and that there was no version of justice that required its servants to be hollow in order to be honest. She wrote, at the very end, a line she considered cutting twice and ultimately kept. Perhaps the defender of the peace should let someone bring him supper occasionally. Eating alone every evening is efficient, but it is not living. She posted it and went to bed and did not sleep for a long time, because she had realized, lying in the dark, that she had been watching the sheriff eat his solitary meals so consistently, and so closely that she knew not only that he ate alone, but that he ate at exactly 6:15, that he always began with soup if the kitchen had it, and that he held his book with his left hand and ate with his right, but occasionally forgot to eat at all when a passage absorbed him particularly. She had realized something else too, something that she filed away in the back of her mind and did not take out to examine directly, because examining it directly would require her to make decisions she was not yet ready to make. The correspondence in the Gazette between a friend of justice and a defender of the peace continued for 3 more months, becoming the most widely read feature in the paper's history, which Samuel Webb was delighted to tell anyone who would listen. The town took sides. Prentice and Reverend Caldwell thought the friend of justice made excellent points. Tom Briggs and most of the ranching community favored the defender, though several quietly admitted they found the friend more persuasive. Nobody in Redrock Crossing knew that a friend of justice was Ida Blackwell, or that a defender of the peace was Harlan Lockhart, because both of them were practicing the same strategy of anonymous argument for reasons that were, underneath the stated reasons, identical. They were writing to each other in the only way that felt safe. Harlan Lockhart knew this about himself by September. He had known it, in the place below thought where knowing happens before it becomes articulate, since August, since the letter about the hypothetical sheriff who had become a machine. He had read that letter and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for so long he had forgotten it was not the natural state of the human body. He did not know who wrote it. The friend of justice had never signed anything beyond that name, and Samuel Webb, to his professional credit, refused to disclose his contributors' identities, citing what he called, with magnificent frontier pomposity, the sacred tradition of the free press. Harlan had developed theories. He ruled out most of the women in town within the first month, not from any assumption about women's capacity for political argument, but because the letter style was specific enough that he could identify 2 or 3 likely suspects, and careful observation eliminated them one by one. He had a theory for a while that it was James Alcott, the land agent, who read extensively and had strong views about governance. But a particular letter in October about the emotional cost of institutional power struck him as too personal for Alcott, who wore his professional self so completely that Harlan doubted the man had an interior life he would expose even under a false name. He did not seriously consider Ida Blackwell until November, and when the thought arrived, it arrived all at once, and with the particular quality of things that are obviously true once you stop not thinking them. It arrived because of a conversation. Ida had come to the sheriff's office to report that one of her students had mentioned seeing a man sleeping in the school building after hours, and she was uncertain whether she was required to report this officially or simply deal with it herself. And she wanted to know what his position was on trespassers who were not actively threatening anyone, but were using a public building without permission. He had listened to her lay out the situation and found himself noticing, not for the first time, that she argued the way people wrote when they had thought extensively before speaking. She organized her points in a specific sequence, acknowledged the complications before reaching conclusions, and had a way of anticipating the objection he was about to raise before he could raise it. You think the trespasser should be treated differently if the trespass is motivated by necessity, he said. I think necessity is a factor, she said, without being an excuse. The distinction matters. And he had thought, the friend of justice writes exactly like this. And then he had thought, do not be a fool, Lockhart. And then he had spent the next 3 weeks being a fool in the most private possible way, going back through the letters and reading them in her voice, and discovering that the voice fit them so precisely that the discovery felt less like a revelation and more like recognition. He did not approach her about it. He did not know how to approach her about it without exposing the fact that the defender of the peace was himself, and that he had been writing to her, without knowing it was her, with more honesty than he had managed to give any living person in at least 5 years. The thought of that exposure was not something he could approach directly. It felt like walking toward a fire. What he did instead, in the way of a man who has been alone long enough that his methods for not being alone have become entirely lateral, was begin to be present in ways he had not been before. He stopped in at the school once, in early November, to fix a hinge on the door that had been giving trouble. He was aware that this was nominally the responsibility of the town's maintenance fund and not of the sheriff, but the maintenance fund was managed by Tom Briggs, who was slow about everything, and the hinge was genuinely broken. Ida thanked him with the precise, warm politeness she used for everything, and he left, and stood in the street for a moment with the particular feeling of a man who has done something very small in the service of something very large, and is not sure the proportions are sustainable. In December, he ate one meal in the Saguaro Rest's dining hall with his book turned face down on the table, which he had not done since he could remember. He did not speak to anyone. But the book was turned down, and that was something. Ida noticed. She noticed because she noticed everything about him, had noticed everything about him since July, and she was sitting at the far end of the dining hall with Rebecca Navarro, the mother of 2 of her students, who was teaching her to make a specific type of corn tortilla in exchange for Ida's help corresponding with a land office in Tucson about a boundary dispute. And she registered the turned-down book from across the room and felt something warm and inconvenient move through her chest. She was not, she told herself firmly, going to do anything about that feeling. She had come to Redrock Crossing to teach. She had come to grow. She had not come to develop complicated feelings for a solitary, impenetrable man who thought the friend of justice was a meddling fool. That last thought punctured the warmth quite effectively, and she returned her attention to the tortilla discussion. Curtis Halley, the powerful rancher east of town, had been watching the Redrock Crossing Gazette letters with growing irritation since September. He was a man who had spent 15 years acquiring land and influence in the territory through methods that existed in the gray area between opportunism and corruption, and a friend of justice's arguments about the necessity of impartial law enforcement were, from his perspective, a direct and dangerous threat to the ecosystem he had carefully constructed. He did not know who the friend of justice was either, but he had his own theory, and his theory pointed at a man named Thomas Garrett, who ran the small newspaper in the county seat 40 miles east and who had been writing critically about Halley's land dealings for 2 years. Halley was wrong, But he was so committed to his theory that he had already sent 2 men to Garrett's office to discourage him, which Garrett had reported to a territorial newspaper, which had made the whole situation considerably worse for Hallie. Hallie's real target was always Lockhart. If he could remove Lockhart, replace him with a sheriff more amenable to looking the other way on certain contractual arrangements involving water rights and grazing boundaries, then the letters in the Gazette would become irrelevant, and Garrett could write whatever he liked. He had been working on this problem since Lockhart's appointment 3 years ago, and in January of 1884, he decided the time had come for a more direct approach. Harlan became aware of the specific nature of Hallie's plans on a Thursday evening in late January, when a man named Pete Darvish, who worked the eastern fence line on Hallie's ranch and had a conscience that intermittently inconvenienced him, came into the sheriff's office after dark and told Harlan in a low, rapid voice that Hallie had hired 2 men from outside the territory to come to Redrock Crossing in February, find a reason to discredit the sheriff publicly, and if that failed, to arrange something more permanent. Harlan listened to Darvish without expression. He asked 3 clarifying questions. He thanked Darvish, told him to go home and act normally, and watched him leave. Then he sat for a long time in the quiet office with the lamp burning low, and thought about the word permanent and what it meant for a man who had, for the first time in years, reasons he was only beginning to identify for not wanting to be removed from a particular place. He did not tell anyone about the threat. This was consistent with his general approach to things that threatened him, which was to deal with them as directly and quietly as possible, and to not generate alarm until alarm was warranted. He wrote a letter to the territorial marshal's office in Prescott, informing them of the situation in language that was legally precise without being melodramatic. Then he waited. The 2 men Hallie had hired arrived in Redrock Crossing on February the 8th, a cold, bright morning, on horseback from the east. They were not obviously sinister. Harlan had learned long ago that obviously sinister men rarely lasted long enough in the profession to be hired for anything complicated. They were just 2 men who checked into the Saguaro Rest and asked questions around town about where a person could find work and who was important to know. Their presence created a shift in the atmosphere of Redrock Crossing that was not visible to most people, but was entirely visible to Harlan, who had been trained by years of frontier law enforcement to read the barometric pressure of human situations the way a good scout reads weather. He also noticed that it was visible to Ida Blackwell, which surprised him, and then, on reflection, did not surprise him at all. He was coming out of the general store on a Wednesday morning when he saw her standing very still on the boardwalk, watching one of the 2 men, whose name turned out to be Vickers, talking to Tom Briggs outside the land office. Her stillness was not casual. It was the stillness of someone paying close, uncomfortable attention, and when she saw Harlan emerge from the store, she crossed to him with a directness that was characteristic of her and said quietly, "That man spoke to 3 of my students' fathers yesterday. He was asking about your routines." Harlan looked at her. "What specifically did he ask? What time you do your evening rounds? Whether you always take the same route? Whether you have a family?" The last item landed with a particular weight that neither of them acknowledged directly. "Thank you," he said. "I am aware of the situation." She looked at him for a moment with those dark eyes that missed nothing and said, "You should not walk your rounds alone this week." "I always walk them alone." "That is precisely what concerns me," she said, and then she turned and walked back toward the school, and he stood on the boardwalk in the February cold and felt something in his chest that he was not ready to name. He did not alter his rounds. He was not willing to alter them, partly from principle and partly from the particular stubbornness of a man who refuses to demonstrate that he has been frightened, even when he has. But he was careful, in ways that did not show, and on the 4th evening after Vickers and his partner had arrived, he was waiting in a doorway on the back street when Vickers came around the corner, and the confrontation that followed was brief and entirely sufficient. He put Vickers in the jail cell with a charge of threatening a law officer, which he could support because Vickers had been carrying a weapon with a hammer back in a public street at 11 at night, and the second man had left town before dawn the next morning. He sent another letter to the territorial marshal, then wrote to the county district attorney about Curtis Halley. This was the beginning of what would turn out to be a 6-month legal process that would eventually result in Halley being charged with conspiracy to intimidate a law officer and several related violations, a process which Harlan pursued with the kind of methodical, unhurried thoroughness that was his particular professional gift. None of that is the point, though. The point is what happened 3 days after Vickers went into the cell, which was a Thursday evening, and Ida Blackwell appeared at the door of the sheriff's office at 6:45 with a covered dish. Harlan was at his desk with a territorial law code open in front of him. He looked up when the door opened. He looked at the dish. He looked at her. "I heard you have been skipping the dining hall this week," she said. Her voice was perfectly steady and her expression was perfectly composed, and she was, he could see, working quite hard to make both of those things true. "Rebecca Navarro made extra tamales and thought you might appreciate them." They both knew that Rebecca Navarro was a kind woman who had not sent those tamales. Harlan knew it, and Ida knew that he knew it, and the space between the knowledge and the pretense of it was charged with something that made the air in the office feel considerably warmer than the February temperature warranted. "Thank you," he said, as he had said to her in April when he carried her bags with the same careful neutrality, the same acceptance of something offered with more confidence than invitation. She set the dish on his desk. She looked at the law code. She looked at the papers beside it. "Is he going to be charged?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Which of his crimes would you like to discuss? There are several." Something moved in her expression. Something that was not quite a smile but occupied the same neighborhood. "You know who I was really asking about. Halley will face charges," he said. "It will take time." "It always does," she said. She left and he sat alone with the tamales and the law code, and the very specific, inconvenient awareness that the office felt emptier than it had before she was in it, which was a feeling he had no established procedure for managing. What he did was eat the tamales and go back to the law code and write, that night, the letter to the Gazette that he had been constructing in his head for 2 weeks. He wrote as the defender of the peace, and he wrote about the experience of being threatened, which he framed as a hypothetical, about what it revealed about a person when their position was truly endangered. He wrote that he had discovered, in a situation of genuine threat, that the things worth protecting were not what he had expected them to be. That the law was worth protecting, yes, but that the law was worth protecting because of specific people, and that he had found himself, in the moment of threat, thinking of specific people rather than abstract principles, and that this had surprised him. He did not write her name. He did not write anything that would identify her to anyone who did not already know, and no one already knew. But he wrote it, and he left it at the print shop, and when the next Gazette came out, he watched Ida read her copy in the dining hall from across the room, and saw the moment she reached the letter, which he could identify because she went completely still in the way she always did when something commanded her complete attention. She wrote back the following week. A friend of justice wrote about the nature of protection, about how it changed in meaning when the person doing the protecting finally had something they were protecting for, rather than simply because it was required of them. She wrote, "Perhaps the defender has discovered that duty and desire are not the contradictions he believed them to be. Perhaps the truest enforcement of the law is the one that comes from a man who has, at last, something to lose." Harlan read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his vest pocket and wore it there for a week before he transferred it to the box where he kept all the others. March arrived and brought with it the particular quality of Arizona spring, the brief, spectacular window between the cold of winter and the absolute sovereignty of summer heat, when the desert bloomed in a way that seemed almost violent in its suddenness, deep orange poppies and yellow brittlebush, and the improbable purple of owl's clover stretching away from the town in every direction. Harlan took to walking in the morning rather than the evening. He did not examine this decision. He simply found that morning walking was what he did now, and morning walking, by a geographic coincidence that he absolutely refused to analyze, took him past the school at approximately the time that Ida Blackwell arrived to unlock it and prepare for the day. They began to talk, not in any formal or acknowledged way. They simply found themselves standing at the edge of the school's small yard in the clear morning air, speaking about whatever presented itself. The territorial news, a book she was reading, a land dispute he was trying to untangle, the question of whether Redrock Crossing would eventually get a proper post office, which both of them considered somewhat optimistically. He discovered that she had opinions about everything, and had reached them by actually thinking rather than by inheriting them from her environment, which he found so unusual in his daily experience that it was, initially, mildly disorienting. She had a way of taking a position, holding it for examination, and revising it if the revision was warranted, all in the same conversation, without treating the revision as defeat. He had never seen anyone do this so comfortably before. He found it, against his better judgment, extraordinarily attractive. She discovered that underneath the flatness and the impenetrability and the fierce, focused dedication to doing things correctly, there was a man who had read a great deal, and remembered everything he read and connected things across vast distances of subject matter in ways that were, when he let them show, genuinely brilliant. She discovered that he had a dry, almost invisible sense of humor that surfaced only when he felt safe, which he rarely did, which made the occasions when it surfaced feel like a gift. She found herself thinking about him constantly. She found herself writing letters that were increasingly personal in their concern for the specific human being she was writing them to, even though she was writing them to a pseudonym that she had not yet confirmed was him, which was its own particular form of madness. She had her own theory by March. She had had it since February, since the letter about the experience of being threatened, which had been written with such specific detail about what it felt like to have your position endangered in a small town, and about the discovery of what was worth protecting, that she had known in her body, if not fully in her mind, exactly who had written it. She did not act on it. She did not know how to act on it without the same risk he faced, the exposure of 6 months of increasingly honest correspondence that had been conducted under the protection of anonymity, and the exposure of feelings that she had not spoken aloud even to herself. April came, 1 year since her arrival. She wrote a letter in early April that departed from her usual argumentative frame entirely. A friend of justice wrote, "I have been writing to this page for nearly a year. I began writing because I believed certain principles needed defending. I have come to understand that I am no longer writing for the principles alone. I write because there is someone reading who makes me want to be more precise, more honest, more exact than I might otherwise choose to be. I do not know his name. He does not know mine. I do not know whether this is the loneliest correspondence I have ever maintained or the most intimate, possibly both." She left it at the print shop and walked to the school with her heart going at a pace she associated with professional examinations rather than walks to work. And she spent the day teaching fractions and the geography of the Great Plains with the meticulous focus of a woman who is using competence as a form of emotional management. The next gazette came out. The defender of the peace wrote, "To the friend of justice, the same," 2 words, and Ida sat in the dining hall and read them and felt them move through her like a current. 2 days later she was walking past the sheriff's office after school, and Harlan came out of the door as she passed, and they nearly collided, and he reached out automatically and his hand closed around her arm to steady her, and they were both very still for a moment, very close, and she looked up at him and he looked down at her, and she said, "Harlan," and he said, "Ida." And then they both stepped back simultaneously and the moment passed. And she walked on and he stood in the street and watched her go, and the word permanent from Darvish's warning 6 months ago came back to him, but in an entirely different context. He was in love with her. He had known it for some time in the below-thought place, and now it had arrived fully above the surface where he could not manage it by not thinking it, and he stood in the April street with this knowledge, and felt simultaneously like the richest and most helpless man in Redrock Crossing. The crisis point came on a Tuesday in mid-April, which was, though Harlan did not know this, exactly 1 year from the day Ida had arrived in town. Elias Prentice mentioned in passing at the general store, to a group of people that included both Ida and Harlan separately at different moments in the same morning, that Samuel Webb had been ill and that he, Prentice, had been helping with the Gazette's correspondence as a favor, sorting the letters that came in for the column, and that the friend of justice was, as he said it with a small and not malicious smile, a woman, if I am reading the handwriting correctly, and that she was apparently local. Given how specifically she wrote about local issues, Harlan was at the hardware counter when Prentice said this to Tom Briggs. Ida was at the dry goods counter when Prentice said this to Rebecca Navarro. Neither of them was present for the other's conversation, but both of them spent the rest of the morning in a state of altered awareness, like people who have heard a sound they cannot quite identify but which has changed the character of the air around them. He went looking for the letters that evening. Not that he needed to look. He knew where they were, the box in the locked desk drawer. He took them all out, 15 of them, and laid them on his desk in the lamplight and read them in sequence from the first to the most recent. And this time he read them not as arguments but as a person, and the person they were was unmistakably, perfectly, with a clarity that made his chest ache with something compound and overwhelming, Ida Blackwell. Every precise construction of argument, every willingness to acknowledge complexity without losing the point, every careful, specific observation about what it actually cost a person to hold a position of responsibility in a place that was still deciding what it wanted to be. And that line in the August letter about the hypothetical sheriff who ate his meals alone, she had been watching him, she had seen him. She had written directly at him and he had written directly back, and they had been, for 8 months, the most intimate strangers in Redrock Crossing. He sat at his desk for a long time. He thought about what to do. He thought about the possibility of doing nothing, letting it remain private knowledge, continuing as they were, which would mean losing the one thing that had made the correspondence feel like anything other than intellectual exercise, which was the possibility that it might become something real. He thought about Ida Blackwell standing in the schoolyard in the April morning with her dark reddish-brown hair catching the early light, talking about the geography of the Great Plains with the same passion she brought to territorial law, and the thought of continuing to exist at 6 feet of careful distance from that particular person, while carrying the knowledge of what she had written to him, in the dark, by candlelight, with more honesty than most people managed in a lifetime, was not a thought he could complete to its logical end. The next day was Wednesday. He woke before dawn, dressed, strapped on his badge, and went about his morning duties with the same unreadable efficiency that characterized his every professional hour. He checked on the jail, which was empty this week. He reviewed 2 reports from Deputy Calhoun. He did his morning walk, which took him past the school at the usual time, but Ida was not at the school. She was at the fence line at the edge of her yard, which she had been meaning to check, because one of the students had mentioned that a post was loose, and that the younger children were pushing at it in a way that would eventually bring the whole section down. And she was at the fence with a hand on the post in question, when she heard boots on the packed earth, and looked up, and saw Harlan coming toward her with a deliberateness that was different from his usual deliberateness. He stopped at the fence. He was on the road side and she was on the school side, and the fence rail was between them, and he put his hands on it, wrapped around the top rail the way she would later remember so precisely, and he looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes that had always seemed to look through things rather than at them. "I have to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I have kept every letter you ever wrote," he said, and his voice was so quiet that the words almost disappeared into the dry Arizona wind. Without knowing it was you, the moment expanded around them. The light was the particular clean light of April morning in Arizona territory, still cool, coming in flat and gold from the east, and the town was beginning to make its morning sounds behind him, and Ida felt the world rearrange itself around those two sentences in a way that nothing would ever fully rearrange back. "What did you say to me?" she whispered. He said it again, and it was not quiet this time. And then she told him what she had heard from the other side of the jailhouse door, his voice saying meddling fool, and the particular brightness in her voice when she said it was not anger. She understood that now, standing here, it was the sound of someone who had felt something very specific at that moment, and had spent 7 months writing her way toward the ability to say it directly. He was very still after she said it. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, which was the expression of a man who has been caught not in wrongdoing but in truth, which is in some ways a more intimate exposure. "I also said it was beautifully written," he said. "You said that privately." "Everything I have said to you that mattered I have said privately," he said. "Everything I have wanted to say to you directly I have been saying to your pseudonym for 8 months." He paused. "I am aware of the irony." "The loneliest correspondence you had ever maintained," she said softly, using his own words back at him, the words he had written as the defender reading her letter about intimacy and loneliness. "Or the most intimate." You wrote back 2 words. "They were the most honest 2 words I had written in 5 years," he said. "The fence was between them. The fence was genuinely in the way." She looked at it, and then she looked at him and she said, "Can you come around, please?" He came around the fence in 3 strides, through the gate that she unlatched by reaching behind her without taking her eyes off him, and then there was no fence between them, and they were standing in the schoolyard in the April morning with nothing between them and the particular terrifying open space of 2 people who have finally stopped having any reason not to say what they mean. "I know who the defender of the peace is," she said. "I know who the friend of justice is," he said. "We have been writing love letters to each other for 8 months," she said, "under false names." Something moved through his expression that she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting, something that was not the near laughter she had seen twice before, but the full version, warm and real and briefly unguarded, and it changed his face so entirely that she had to recalibrate everything she knew about what he looked like. "We have," he said. "Harlan," she said. "Ida," he said. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, which was a thing she had not planned but which her hand seemed to know to do before her mind had fully consented to it. And he went very still in the way he did when something surprised him, and then he covered her hand with his, and they stood in the April light with that particular suspended quality of people at the beginning of something so large they have not yet found the words for it. He did not kiss her that morning. He was not a man who moved without consideration. He walked her to the school door, and they talked for 20 minutes in the door frame about things that were almost entirely not about the enormous thing that had just happened between them, the way 2 people circle something significant before they are ready to step directly into it. And when her students began arriving, he touched the brim of his hat in the old frontier courtesy and walked back through the gate, and she watched him go with her hand on the door frame, and her heart conducting itself in a manner she was certain the whole school could hear. He came back that evening at 6:15, exactly the time she had memorized without meaning to, and knocked at the door of the hotel room she still kept, having not yet found a more permanent arrangement in town. She opened the door. He was holding his hat in his hands, which was the only external evidence of what the gesture cost him, a man who held things in his hands when he was uncertain what to do with them. "I would like to buy you supper," he said. "In the dining hall, not alone." "Not alone," she agreed. They sat at the same table. He left his book face down the entire meal. They talked for 2 hours, and it was nothing like their morning conversations and nothing like their letters, and it was better than either of those things because there was no fence between them and no pseudonym between them, and the only thing between them now was the small, charged space across a dining table in a frontier hotel, which was a space both of them could see clearly and intended to cross. He walked her to the bottom of the stairs. He stood on the first step and she stood on the second, so they were almost the same height, and he looked at her for a long moment, and she waited, and he said, very quietly, "I should tell you something else." "Tell me," she said. "I have never been good at this," he said, "at the human part of things. I became a sheriff partly because the law is a clear language and human beings are not, and I have spent 11 years enforcing a clear language because I could not speak the other one." "You wrote me 15 letters in the other language," she said. He looked at the hat in his hands. "I did not know they were to you. Would you have written them differently if you had known?" He considered this with the gravity he brought to everything. "No," he said, "they would not have been different. I would have been more frightened." "Harlan," she said very gently. "Yes, I am entirely fluent in both languages," she said. "I will translate when you need." He looked up at her, and then finally he leaned forward and kissed her once carefully, a thing both precise and tender, a first sentence in a language they were both beginning. Spring became summer, and summer was bright and absolutely relentless, and the school was out from late June, which meant Ida had long hours that she filled with writing and visiting, and the gradual, unhurried process of making a deeper home in Redrock Crossing than her hotel room had ever been. She moved into a small adobe house on the west side of town in July, the house having been vacated by a mining surveyor who had moved on to Colorado. It had 3 rooms, a kitchen garden that had been somewhat neglected, and a window in the main room that faced east and caught the morning light exactly the way she wanted. Harlan helped her move. He carried boxes with the same quiet efficiency he had carried her bags 15 months ago, and she thought about that and said, standing in her new kitchen with her hands on a stack of books, "You carried my bags the first day I arrived." "I did," he said. "I was irritated." "I know," he said. "You smiled at me very politely and your eyes said something else entirely." She looked at him. "I did not think you noticed things like that." "I noticed everything about you from the beginning," he said. "I simply had no framework for what to do with what I noticed. And now I have the letters," he said, "which is apparently how I communicate things that matter." She laughed, and it was a real laugh, the kind that came from surprise rather than performance, and he watched her laugh with an expression that he no longer tried to make neutral. The Curtis Halley matter resolved in September of 1884, after 6 months of territorial legal proceedings that Harlan navigated with the methodical patience of a man who has infinite capacity for waiting for the right outcome. Halley was charged and ultimately paid substantial fines, and lost his water rights claim on the eastern properties that had been at the center of most of his illegal activity. He did not go to prison, which was a compromise of the justice the situation warranted, but he left Redrock Crossing permanently the following spring, which solved the practical problem, and Harlan was practical enough to accept that. The town felt different after Halley left, lighter. As though a specific pressure had been released from the air. People who had been cautious became less cautious. The land office processed claims without the shadow of Halley's interference. The Navarro family expanded their farm to the south, and no one disputed their right to do so. Samuel Webb recovered from his illness and resumed full control of the Gazette, and a friend of justice wrote one final letter in October of 1884. It was brief and different from everything before it. To the defender of the peace, it read, "I have realized over the course of this correspondence that I began it in order to argue for justice and ended it in order to argue for you. As it happens, the 2 propositions were always the same. I am glad we have found each other by name. Your friend of justice, who is, in the full light of day, Ida Blackwell, schoolteacher, who keeps your letters too." Samuel Webb published it and then stood in his print shop and looked at it for a long time and said to no one in particular, "Well, that explains several things." By Christmas of 1884, Redrock Crossing knew that their sheriff was courting their schoolteacher, which they had actually known since August, because small towns always know, but the formal acknowledgement of it changed the quality of the knowing. People made room for it. Rebecca Navarro brought food to Harlan's office with a regularity and persistence that suggested deep satisfaction on her part. Reverend Caldwell mentioned, in two separate conversations with people who mentioned it to Harlan, that he was available whenever needed. Harlan asked Ida to marry him on an evening in January of 1885 in her kitchen, where they had fallen into the habit of eating dinner together most evenings, and he had cooked, which was a skill she had discovered he possessed, and which he deployed infrequently but with genuine competence. He did not make a speech. He asked her in a single clear sentence, looking at her across the kitchen table with the gray eyes that no longer looked through her but at her, fully, and with the particular attention of a man who has stopped protecting himself from what he sees. "Yes," she said, in one equally clear word, and then she said, "I would like to write you a letter about it later." "I will keep it with the others," he said. They were married in February, in the church that doubled as the schoolhouse, by Reverend Caldwell, who performed the ceremony with barely contained delight. The whole town came. All 14 of Ida's students sat in the front pews with their best clothes on, and the particular contained vibration of children who have been told to sit still and are doing their very best. Rebecca Navarro made the food, which was extraordinary. Deputy Calhoun cried, which he denied vigorously afterward and which everyone present ignored, because they had all seen it. Ida wore a dress the color of deep sage green that she had ordered from a seamstress in Tucson, because she had decided that she was going to be married once, and she was going to be married in a color she actually liked rather than conventional white, which she privately found impractical for a desert setting. Harlan wore his best suit and his badge, which she had told him she wanted him to wear, because the badge was part of who he was, and she had fallen in love with the whole of him. He stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him, and his expression was, for once, completely open, which was the thing she thought she would remember longest about that day. Longer than the flowers Rebecca had found, or the sound of the Reverend's voice, or the particular angle of the February light through the church windows. She would remember his face, wide open, looking at her. They said their vows. The traditional ones, because Harlan was a precise man, and the traditional ones said what needed to be said with economy. And Ida agreed that, when language already existed for something and did the job correctly, there was no need to replace it. They moved into Ida's adobe house together, it being marginally larger than the sheriff's quarters attached to the jail, and they began the particular negotiation of two fully formed, independent people sharing a space, which had its moments of friction and its moments of discovery in roughly equal proportion. They discovered that they were both early risers and late readers, which made the mornings and evenings natural. They discovered that Harlan's method of organizing things prioritized logical access and Ida's prioritized thematic coherence, and that these two systems were mutually incomprehensible, which required negotiation that was sometimes spirited but never unkind. They discovered that they could disagree about something, argue it fully and without retreating, and then return to each other at the end of it without damage, which was the thing both of them had been most uncertain about and which turned out to be, in practice, the thing they were both surprisingly good at. He still ate with his book sometimes. She had never asked him to stop and never would. But the book was more often face down, and sometimes he read to her from it, and sometimes she read to him from what she was writing, and the evenings in the adobe house had a quality that neither of them had words for at first and eventually found the word: home. Spring of 1885 brought the news that Ida was expecting, which arrived with the particular combination of joy and practical reckoning that accompanies that kind of news in frontier settlements, where the nearest proper hospital was in Tucson, and the town doctor, Gerald Fenwick, had improved somewhat from his previous state, but was still not what you would call a first choice. Harlan took this news with a stillness that Ida had learned to read correctly, which meant he was processing something of considerable magnitude and was not yet ready to speak. "Are you frightened?" she asked. "Yes," he said immediately, and the absence of hesitation in that answer was itself a measure of how far he had come from the man who had wrapped himself in impenetrability because vulnerability felt like a tactical disadvantage. "So am I," she said. "Somewhat, mostly I am very glad." "I am very glad," he said. "I am also very frightened. Both of those are true." "Good," she said. "That means you are taking it seriously." He looked at her. "I take everything involving you seriously." "I know," she said, and she reached across the table and put her hand in his, and they sat with the news together in the kitchen in the April evening, until it stopped being frightening enough to need to name. Rebecca Navarro, who had 4 children and had assisted at 6 births in the territory, immediately appointed herself the primary support system for Ida's pregnancy, which Ida accepted with gratitude that was entirely genuine. Rebecca was practical, experienced, and had an excellent relationship with a midwife in the next town over who agreed to come to Redrock Crossing for the birth. The pregnancy proceeded through the Arizona summer, which was its own particular challenge, the heat being the kind that made any physical discomfort more acute and any good moment feel more precious. And Ida taught through the spring term and into May before agreeing, on the firm united advice of Rebecca and Harlan, to reduce her teaching hours to mornings only, handing the afternoon sessions to a young woman named Clara Mills, who had recently arrived in town with 2 years of teaching experience and a willingness to work. Harlan was attentive in the careful, deliberate way that characterized everything he did. He was not demonstrative in public, that had not changed, but in the privacy of their home he had discovered, or perhaps remembered, a gentleness that he was entirely capable of, and which he directed at her with a steadiness that she found, as the months passed, to be one of the most sustaining things she had ever known. He read about the medical aspects of pregnancy from every text he could obtain, which meant he was occasionally more worried than the situation warranted, because medical texts at that time were somewhat alarming as a genre, and Ida periodically had to reassure him that Rebecca and the midwife knew considerably more practical medicine than any book currently available. He wrote her a letter in August, not to a pseudonym, not to the Gazette, but to her, folded and left on her desk on a morning when she woke to find him already gone on his early rounds. She read it sitting in the morning light in their kitchen, and it was, like everything he wrote, precise and honest and more beautiful for being unadorned. He wrote that he had spent years making himself small in order to be sufficient for the work he had chosen, and that she had made him large again without asking him to change anything that mattered, and that the person they were building together in this house was the most important thing he had ever had responsibility for, and that he intended to be worthy of it for the rest of his life. She wrote back immediately and left the letter on his desk. She wrote that she had come to Redrock Crossing to plant herself somewhere new and see if she could grow differently, and that she had grown in every direction she had wanted to grow, and some she had not expected, and that growing toward him was the direction that had changed everything else. Their son was born on a cold night in October 1885, a little earlier than expected but healthy, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's terrifying calm, which even the midwife found remarkable in a newborn. Harlan sat beside Ida in the lamplight after it was over, and held his son with the careful, focused attention of a man performing something of the highest possible precision, and Ida watched him and felt something move through her that was past the reach of language. They named him William James Lockhart, William for Ida's grandfather, James because Harlan had had a younger brother by that name whom he had lost to a fever when they were children, which was a thing he had told her in pieces, over months, the way he told all the true things about himself, slowly and honestly, with the trust of a man who has decided to be known. William James Lockhart was a substantial presence in Redrock Crossing from his first weeks. He was sociable in the way his mother was sociable, interested in everything, and calm in the way his father was calm, which meant that the school children adored him, and the townspeople took an immediate collective ownership of his well-being that Ida found touching and Harlan found mildly overwhelming. Deputy Calhoun declared himself an honorary uncle, which no one disputed. Rebecca Navarro brought food with renewed purpose. Reverend Caldwell gave a small sermon on the blessings of new life that managed to be about the Lockhart child without technically being about the Lockhart child, which was a skill worth acknowledging. Clara Mills took over the full teaching position in October while Ida was confined, and proved herself so excellent that by December Ida had arranged with the school board for both of them to teach, splitting the students by age, which was better for everyone, and which gave Ida's mornings back by January. Harlan watched all of this from the still center that was his natural position in any situation, and the thing that Ida noticed, which she would tell him about years later, was that the center of him had shifted. He was still still. He was still precise and serious and fundamentally incapable of small talk. He still walked his rounds with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who considers attention to duty a form of integrity. But the stillness was different now. It had warmth in it where it had previously had only cold. It had direction. It was the stillness of a man who knew exactly where he was going when he was finished with the work, and who valued the work more, not less, for that knowing. Redrock Crossing grew in the years that followed in the way that frontier towns grew when they had something to grow around, which was usually a combination of economic stability and community trust, and Redrock Crossing had, through the combination of Hallie's departure and Harlan's steady governance, both of these things. By 1887, there was a proper post office, which solved the Deputy Calhoun informal mail system to everyone's satisfaction, and a new schoolhouse built separate from the church, which the Reverend Caldwell found both disappointing and secretly relieving. Ida stopped writing to the Gazette under any name after her marriage, having decided that the conversation she had been trying to have through that channel was now being had directly, which was its preferred and most efficient form. She continued to write because she always would, but what she wrote now was different. A series of essays about frontier education that she sent to a territorial educational journal in Prescott, and which were received with sufficient enthusiasm that a man named Howard Bright, who edited the journal, wrote to ask if she would be willing to write a regular column. She wrote the column for 6 years. It became one of the most widely read features in territorial educational circles, and it brought her into correspondence with educators across Arizona Territory and New Mexico and eventually Colorado, a network of people thinking seriously about how to give frontier children an education that prepared them for the world they were actually going to inherit rather than the world that the Eastern written textbooks assumed they lived in. She wrote about this, the gap between the textbooks and the territory, in the column that Harlan read with the careful attention he gave everything she wrote, and he told her one evening, quietly, that what she was describing in those essays was exactly what he had been trying to do with the law since the beginning, trying to apply something written for a different place to the specific human circumstances of the place he actually occupied. "We have always been working on the same problem," she said. "From different directions," he said, "and by entirely different methods. Mine involved more confrontation," he said. "Mine involved more ink," she said. Their second child arrived in the spring of 1888, a girl they named Ruth Helena Lockhart, Helena for Ida's mother. Ruth was from the beginning entirely unlike her brother, loud and determined, and magnificently opinionated in a way that Harlan looked at with an expression Ida could only interpret as recognition. Ruth was going to argue with everyone and be right about a significant proportion of it, and both of her parents found this wonderful. William, at 2 years old, greeted his sister with the solemn assessment of a small person who has been told something significant is about to happen and wishes to evaluate the claim personally, and then declared her satisfactory, which was the highest praise in his limited but precise vocabulary. The family settled into the rhythms of their life in the adobe house on the west side of Redrock Crossing, rhythms that shifted and expanded as the children grew, and the town grew, and the territory itself moved through the changes of the late 1880s, the railroad coming closer, the cattle industry shifting, the long argument about Arizona statehood beginning to pick up serious momentum. Harlan served as sheriff through all of it. He was reappointed without opposition in 1886 and again in 1889. The town had grown comfortable with his particular form of governance, which was so consistent and so honest that it had become, over time, the bedrock against which everything else in Redrock Crossing was measured. He was not a popular man in the way that popular men are popular, and this had not changed. But the trust had deepened into something beyond trust, something closer to the kind of certainty people feel about the ground beneath their feet, which is that it will be there when they step. He told Ida, on the 10th anniversary of her arrival in Redrock Crossing, what he had been thinking about for several weeks, which was that he was considering whether the time had come to step away from the badge. Not because he was tired of the work exactly, but because the territory was changing and the work was changing with it, and the qualities that had made him excellent at the job in 1881 were not precisely the same as what the job required in 1893, and he was honest enough to see the difference and thoughtful enough to consider what it meant. "What would you do?" she asked. "Law," he said, "but differently. I have been corresponding with an attorney in Prescott about the possibility of reading for the bar." She looked at him. "You have been corresponding with someone in Prescott?" "I have. About a major life decision. I wanted to understand the parameters before I raised it." She was quiet for a moment. "You are impossible," she said without heat. "You knew that in April of 1883, he said. "You chose me anyway." "I chose you because of your letters," she said, "which were addressed to no one in particular and turned out to be addressed to you," he said, "which I maintain is a more romantic origin story than most people manage." She laughed. He was right about that, and she told him so, and then she told him that if he wanted to read law and sit the bar examination, she thought he would be very good at it, and she would support him in every way she could, and she was proud of him for having the self-awareness to see what the moment required. He studied for the bar examination through 1893 and passed it in early 1894, whereupon he resigned his sheriff's position to a deputy named Marcus Webb, who was Samuel the printer's nephew, and had served under Harlan for 4 years with the kind of quiet, determined honesty that Harlan recognized, because he had spent 30 years trying to live by it himself. He opened a law office in Redrock Crossing in the spring of 1894, in a small storefront near the post office. The sign above the door read, "H. Lockhart, Attorney at Law," in plain painted letters, and Ida stood in the street and looked at it with a feeling she recognized as specifically, privately triumphant. William was 8 years old by then, and had developed a fascination with mathematics that his father quietly encouraged by bringing home every book on the subject the Territorial Library Exchange could provide, which was Harlan's particular language for enthusiasm. Ruth was 6 and had already been described by Clara Mills as the most argumentative and simultaneously most logical child I have taught in 10 years. Which Ida put in a letter to a friend in Santa Fe as the highest possible compliment. The law practice grew. Harlan was a good attorney for exactly the same reasons he had been a good sheriff, because he was honest about the law's limitations as well as its power, because he prepared more thoroughly than anyone else, and because the people who came to him knew that he would tell them the truth about their situation, even when the truth was not what they wanted to hear. He worked in the law office through the long days and came home in the evenings, and the adobe house was never quiet now, with children and their various projects, and the particular noise of 2 people who were raising 2 very opinionated small people. And the house had expanded with an additional room added in 1891 that accommodated the growing library that both of them maintained, and that William and Ruth treated as their own personal territory, with a proprietary confidence that both parents found both maddening and entirely appropriate. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary in February of 1895, Harlan went to his desk and found an envelope with his name on it in Ida's handwriting. He opened it. It was a letter. She wrote that she had been thinking, on the occasion of 10 years, about beginnings. About the day she had stepped off a stage in Redrock Crossing with 2 leather bags and an ink-stained hand, and walked into a man who was too busy being impeccably competent to ask where she had come from or why she had come. About the fence post in the schoolyard that she had gone to check because a student said it was loose, and which had been the location of the most important conversation of her life. About 15 letters in a wooden box that she had been writing to a stranger who turned out to be the person she was going to spend her life with. She wrote that 10 years had given her a vocabulary for what she had not had words for in the beginning, which was what it felt like to be known by a specific person who had chosen to know her, and who went on choosing it every day with the same deliberate, unshakable honesty that he brought to everything he did. She wrote that this was the thing she had not known to want before she had it, and that having it made every other thing better, the teaching and the writing and the children and the particular beauty of Arizona territory, in the spring when the desert bloomed like something that could not wait any longer. Everything was better because she shared it with him. She wrote at the end, "I no longer sign my letters to you with a pseudonym. But I would like you to know that a friend of justice is still here, still watching, still paying attention to everything that matters, and still entirely in love with the defender of the peace. Your wife, Ida." He came to find her in the kitchen where she was reading, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her with the open, unguarded expression she had seen for the first time on their wedding day and which he wore now without the effort it had once required, and she looked up and saw him and waited. "I did not write you a letter," he said. "I know," she said. "You are terrible at anniversaries." "I am," he agreed without argument. "What did you do instead?" He came into the kitchen and sat across from her and reached across the table and took her hand. And what he did instead was tell her, directly, in the human language he had once found so much harder than the law's precise vocabulary, everything that the letter would have said. He told her that she had changed the character of his life, that she had given him a reason to be more than his function, that the children they were raising together were the finest thing he had seen in 38 years of living, and that the letters in the box in his desk drawer were the most valuable thing he owned and would remain so until they both died. "That is a very good letter," she said. "It is a statement of fact," he said. "With you, those are the same thing," she said. He held her hand across the kitchen table in the lamplight while the Arizona night settled around the adobe house, and the children slept in their rooms and the town went quiet in the particular way of frontier towns at the end of the day. A silence that was not empty but full of the accumulated lives of people who had chosen this place and made something of it. They sat there for a long time, the two of them, in the home they had built together from a fence post, and a wooden box and 15 letters written in secret to a stranger, until the lamp burned low and the night was deep, and there was nothing left that needed to be said because everything that needed to be said had been said already, and would go on being said in every language they shared, for as long as there were mornings in Redrock Crossing to say it. Ida thought, in that lamplight quiet, about the woman who had stepped off a stage in April of 1883 with ink on her hands, and a secret she had not decided whether to keep, and she thought that the secret she had kept was the best decision she had ever made, because the keeping of it had been the beginning of the finding of him, and the finding of him had been the whole point, though she had not known it when she arrived. The fence post in the schoolyard was repaired properly in the summer of 1895 by Harlan and William working together on a Saturday morning, William handing tools with the concentrated seriousness of an 8-year-old who intends to do the job correctly. Harlan accepting them with the patient precision of a man who is teaching without performing the act of teaching. And Ida watched them from the schoolyard gate with Ruth on her hip, her ink-stained hand on the gate post, and felt the particular kind of joy that does not announce itself but simply arrives, like something that has been traveling a long way and has finally reached the right place. The fence was solid. The post was steady. The town was theirs, and they were its, and the letters were in the box, and the story they had written together across those 8 months of ink and paper and fence-line revelations had become, in the end, the truest and most permanent thing in Redrock Crossing, which was saying something in a territory that had been learning permanence for a long time. They went home together in the Saturday morning light, the 4 of them, through the dusty streets of a town that had grown around them like something that had been waiting for them to arrive. And the door of the adobe house opened, and the light came through the east window exactly as it always did, gold and clean and entirely sufficient. And Harlan held the door and Ida walked through it. And the day began again as it always did, which is to say, with everything it needed already inside it.